So good morning. Thank you so much for being here. I want to say a few words about the day, and then we'll move right into our first event. This conference actually means a lot to me. Usually when we do conferences, I'm trying to get people to talk to one another, people who should hear one another from different sides of the aisle, from different sides of the liberty security conversation. But this one is not about the people talking to each other, the participants, which of course I think we'll enjoy. I think they've heard each other. I think they've been having this conversation for a long time. Today is about what on earth have these 15 years since 9/11 been about? Explain to us the shape of it, take a step back, and tell us, the public, people who like to think about where we're going and what our country's about, tell us what we should think. Have we suffered any losses? Have we accomplished anything? Are there any gains to be gotten? Are there things that were accomplished in the wake of 9/11 that needed to be accomplished anyway? Are we safer? Etc. So this is really for us and for all of the hundreds of events that this center and its predecessor at NYU have hosted. This is really, in some ways, the culmination. It's been 15 years. Somebody has to be accountable, and I think it's us. What we're accountable for is thinking about it and giving the country a narrative of where we were, where we've come, and where we're going. So to that end, my job was trying to find the best people, the people who had thought the most creatively and with some conscience about what we should have done after 9/11 and what we need to do now to protect ourselves and to remain who we are, whatever that is. So if I'd only had one person to invite, it would have been Richard Clarke. If I were president, which I have no desire to be, he would be my national security advisor. And there is no question that in his experience before 9/11 with the Middle East and other issues when he was at the State Department and the Pentagon, and after 9/11, he's been a mind that has mindfully applied itself to who we are, where we should be, and how we should get there. So that isn't very specific, but it's my way of saying thank you so much for being here. And now I'm going to ask you some very hard questions.
I thought that might be the case.
Okay. Yeah. So the question and there'll be time for your Q&A. So the question I want to start with is sort of in the middle, right at the heart of things, which is that in the wake of the Snowden revelations, President Obama commissioned a study of NSA and its practices. And he picked 5 people from the national security establishment to think
5 white guys.
Yes, to think about it. Some of whom had experience inside the intelligence community, some of whom had experience with matters of state, some of whom were lawyers. 5 white guys, as you say. And you produced a report which you all signed off on. And I recommend everybody to read this report because personally I found it illuminating about different policies of the NSA that we read about in headlines, and thoughtful. But there was a sentence in this report that captivated me, and I think it's worth thinking about. And it's in the very beginning of the report when the authors are outlining general guidelines, general thoughts, general principles. And it goes something like this, and I'm paraphrasing. The country's been involved in a debate about liberty and security for a very long time. Actually, when it comes to certain things, there really isn't a debate. And so I just wanted, if we could start by your sort of filling us in about what that sentence meant and why it was there.
Well, I think what we wanted to say in the report on liberty and security, what we wanted to say to the president and to the country was, we've made a lot of mistakes in our history when it comes to the tension between liberty and security. In large part because at times of national trauma, there have always been people who are willing to trade a little bit of liberty for security. and that, in our historical perspective, has always been a mistake that we later regret. And so when people say, well, it's a sliding scale between liberty and security, and when there are times of great threat, you can slide the scale in one direction. I think what we were trying to say is there are some things that are immutable in this country, at least as long as we have our Constitution and the Bill of Rights. And there are things that you just cannot slide the scale against and erode because you've had a terrorist attack. We're very concerned, the authors were very concerned, that if we had another 9/11 or something even worse, or a series of them, that there would be a lot of people in this country who would be willing to slide the scale again against the Bill of Rights. And what we were trying to say is that's never been a good idea historically. It's not a good idea now because the rights are inalienable. That's a funny word, which means you can't do anything to erode them under the Constitution. If you do, you will live to regret it.
So that's sort of interesting given the public debate right now over surveillance. And it's not just the phone from San Bernardino that the director of the FBI wanted a backdoor into and lost that battle. But it's about the larger conversation that surveillance powers keep us safe and therefore we should use them. Can you parse through gradations of that?
Well, I think surveillance powers are necessary in a modern, fragile society such as ours, but they have to be exercised under extraordinary oversight and control. And what we tried to say in the NSA report was, NSA is a potentially very dangerous organization. And if you go back to the Church Commission of the 1970s, what Senator Church said when he investigated NSA and the FBI in the 1970s was, there exists in those two organizations, if you do them in the wrong way, the ability to create a police state from which you can never come back. Now, having created a police state with modern surveillance technology, if you do it without oversight, if you do it without control, if you do it without democratic process, even briefly, you can never turn it off because the mechanisms of the modern technology that are used for surveillance are such that a government with that power could prevent the opposition to it, and you would have it forever. So what we said was, yes, you want to have surveillance for security purposes, but only under very, very rigorous and transparent, this is the key, I think, as well, transparent supervision, oversight, and legal checks.
So you think the Freedom Act, which was passed in the wake of the sunsetting of the relevant clauses in the Patriot Act, gives us the protections we need and the transparency we need?
It gives us most of what we need. The Freedom Act was actually based on our recommendations. There are some of our recommendations which did not get included. I'm still concerned, for example, that the FBI, a supervisor in the FBI, can sign something called a national security letter, which has no judicial oversight, and demand records from banks or internet companies or telephone companies. That recommendation, we made 46 recommendations. I think our batting average is something like 39 out of the 46 have been implemented to some extent or another, so we didn't do too badly. But the one on national security letters still bothers me, and there are a few others.
Interesting. Let's turn to terrorism. Talk about what's happened. And let's start with the death of Bin Laden. Some reporter called the other day and asked if I thought the death of Bin Laden was a game changer. How should I have answered his question? Was it a harbinger of things to come? Did it change anything? What's the answer to this question?
I think it changed things, but not much. I think as long as Bin Laden was alive years after 9/11, it was kind of an indicator of the impotence of the United States and it's kind of a propaganda tool that Al-Qaeda and others used. And And I think as long as he was alive, there was at least a nominal titular head of al-Qaeda Central who could send out little orders to the various franchises, some of which were ignored, but there was someone more or less in charge. And I think after his death, the franchises really became much more independent. I don't think anyone's listening to Zawahiri these days. More independent and, unfortunately, more powerful. Not because he died, but just coincidentally. So we have AQAP in Yemen, which is running a big chunk of Yemen. It's under assault this week by the UAE, but it's a very large organization. And al-Qaeda morphed into Daesh, into ISIS. So, I mean, the sad truth is, in the years after bin Laden's death, not because of it, but coincidentally, what we knew of as al-Qaeda has finally done what we said it would, which is to become a series of more virulent franchises.
One of the things that you are well known for, that you've written about, that others have written about, is the deafness, intentional deafness of the Bush administration, of top officials in the Bush administration, to threats about al-Qaeda. And a lot of what was done after 9/11 was an attempt to correct whatever vulnerabilities in the system led to that reality. Have they been fixed?
Largely.
Are you confident that should we be confident, and you can answer this with some nuance, but that with ISIS and its sort of new kind of use of technology, its different narrative in some ways than al-Qaeda, its outreach in some ways different than al-Qaeda in terms of who it targets, do you think we're on top of it? Because, one of the things that I think struck the American people was that all of a sudden there was ISIS, and the question was, well, where did they come from? And so I think there was a sense, well, what about the preparation from the government saying, hey, there's a threat out there? So how do we?
If the question is, are we on top of the threats in the United States? Mm-hmm. Pretty well. You're never going to be 100%. We have created a counterterrorism bureaucracy, counterterrorism industry, industrial complex in the United States. It's much larger than it needs to be. And I had hoped that President Obama would have the guts, especially in his second term, to pare back the counterterrorism industrial state. But it's risky. I mean, what president wants to be the person who reduces the counterterrorism budget, gets rid of a lot of these overstaffed bureaucracies, and then you have a terrorist event, not because you cut it back, but one that would have occurred anyway, and then you get blamed for having caused the terrorist event because you cut the budget. Someday, somebody's going to have to do that, and it's not too late for Obama to do it, but it's running out of time. But having said that, I think the threats in the United States are well understood. And if anything, the FBI has gone a little bit overboard in creating some of the threats, frankly, by talking people into terrorist attacks or attempted terrorist attacks, trapping people. But that has had an effect of putting a chill on people who want to do organized terrorist attacks in the United States. Lone wolves, of course, still happen and still will happen. But I think we are probably as good as anyone except the Israelis at this point in terms of spotting a terrorist attack being plotted in our country. In other countries, it's not that we didn't see Daesh coming, or ISIS coming, it's that the administration didn't want to do anything about it. And in large respect, that means the Obama administration, in a way, overreacted to the Bush administration's mistakes. Mm-hmm. Let me unpack that. The Bush administration's crazy adventurism in Iraq, sort of war crimes on steroids, counterproductive activity, caused President Obama personally to think, I really don't want to do too much in the Middle East that could get me on a slippery slope to another war. I want to get us out. So he was absolutely right in that instinct, but it made him overcautious, I think. And so when we saw Daesh start to grow, when there was an opportunity to do something about that, when there was an opportunity to help early on to help the rebels in Syria, when it would have made a difference and perhaps would have stopped Daesh in their tracks, he didn't do it.
Interesting.
And so what we have, Karen, as always, this, we have this pendulum that goes from one extreme to the other. And it's really hard to get an administration to hold the pendulum in the middle.
Just constantly, we hope, going back and forth. The 28 pages, which have been in the news.
Yep.
So, there are a lot of people who would like to know what those 20 pages say about, these are the 28 redacted pages from the 9/11 Commission report that are about
from the congressional
report, sorry, that are about right, Saudi Arabia, and there's been some overt criticism of Saudi Arabia in the Congress recently.
Mm-hmm.
I know that Senator Chris Murphy has talked about holding the Saudis accountable for many aspects of terrorism, not just 9/11. So this is a two-pronged question, which is, how should we think about these 28 pages, and how should we think about the relationship between the United States and the Saudis?
Okay. So I think in 5 or 6 weeks you'll all get to read the 28 pages. I think when they're released, they will be accompanied by a explanatory commentary from the administration. The 28 pages are from the joint House Intelligence, Senate Intelligence Committee report. That preceded the 9/11 Commission, and it was largely held behind closed doors. I testified for 7 hours, I think. Not a Hillary Clinton level of testimony, but I think I did a 7-hour testimony behind closed doors. What the 28 pages are about is largely about two terrorists who were 9/11 hijackers named Midar and Hamzi. And they had entered the United States, landed in Los Angeles, and then moved to San Diego over a year before the attack. While they were there, they came across other Saudis. One of those Saudis may have been a Saudi intelligence officer. One of those Saudis may have been an al-Qaeda sympathizer who was working in the consulate in Los Angeles. All of that is laid out in the 9/11 Commission report. So you can already read all of that. The facts are all there. I believe that, and I can't prove this, that the CIA, in conjunction with Saudi intelligence, contacted Midar and Hamzi when they were in Southern California and tried to flip them into CIA sources. And I believe, A, that's illegal. It's a violation of the CIA's authorities. They're not supposed to do stuff like that in the United States. And I believe that they did that secretly without telling me and without telling the FBI, which they were required to do. And I believe that is why for over a year, the FBI didn't know that we had al-Qaeda terrorists in the United States. So that's interesting. Mm-hmm. It's interesting if you want to think about what might have happened. I try not to do that too much, but if I had known that those two guys were in the United States, they would have been arrested. Mm-hmm. Would that have stopped 9/11? We'll never know. But they would have been arrested. So all of that is in the 28 pages. Mm-hmm. There's also a lot of speculation by the joint committees about the involvement of the Saudi government, and particularly something called the Ministry of Islamic Affairs. The Ministry of Islamic Affairs was a cabinet office, still is, in Saudi Arabia, that, among other things, supported the building of mosques around the world and supported the running of those mosques. Those mosques were fundamentalist Wahhabi Sunni mosques that very frequently were places where al-Qaeda people hung out. Were there al-Qaeda sympathizers in the ministry? Yeah, I'm sure there were. Was it a knowing government policy of Saudi Arabia to support al-Qaeda? No, because al-Qaeda was trying to kill them. So unless the king and company had a suicide wish, no, they were not backing al-Qaeda.
Yeah, that makes sense. We are in the middle, I don't know if you've noticed, but we're in the middle of a presidential election.
Today.
And there are a number of individuals running, and this was true in the last election, who are not particularly invested so far in foreign affairs, and certainly not in national security. And it really raises the question, what does it mean to be a national security professional? How is it possible that you can run for president or become president and not have a knowledge so that when you are told scary things, you can manage it in a responsible way? And so I guess the real question here is there something that we should do in this country to train national security professionals? Or do we do it and I missed it somehow?
Well, we don't do it enough. We train CIA people in a career path. We have the Foreign Service, which has a career path. We have the military, which has a career path. The fourth element are civilians like me who are not Foreign Service, not intelligence officers. We don't have a really good program for having a career track for national security policy analysts or managers, aside from those Foreign Service CIA programs. I think we need that. We've got great schools turning people out at large numbers. There are now lots of good public policy schools with national security programs. I taught for 5 years at the Kennedy School at Harvard. Not a bad program. Not the best, but not a bad one. And there are others. There's no lack of students going to these graduate programs. There is a lack of the government figuring out how to intake them, train them, give them a career, give them evaluation, give them promotion, give them retraining, the way the military does. The military does a great job of this. Civilians don't. So that's one answer. The other answer is we've had presidents before who on paper didn't have a lot of foreign policy experience. When Bill Clinton showed up at the White House, I was already there. He didn't throw me out, so I stayed. And I didn't know what to expect from him because, you look on paper, he had no foreign policy experience. He knew a lot about foreign policy. But more importantly, if you looked at the people he brought with him, Tony Lake is his national security advisor and others, they were pros. They had done it for 20, 30 years. I think you judge a presidential candidate by the on national security by the national security staff that they have on the campaign, right? And if you look at the national security staff, I don't mean this as a partisan comment, but you all know where my politics are, I think. But if you look at the national security advisors to Donald Trump and to Senator Cruz, they're just frightening. I mean, these are the people who escaped from the loony bin. Yeah, none of them have any credibility in the business. I mean, they're a laughingstock. It's not funny. It's not funny because they're clearly not educating these guys. And who knows? One of them could become president. And if one of them became president and had that group of national security advisors, we'd be in deep trouble.
I want to ask you a little bit about cyber issues.
Your book, you never would.
No, your book, Cyber War, sort of opened a lot of eyes, which was written quite a while ago.
6 years ago.
Now we're ready for another a retail. And sort of things that you predicted have actually come about.
Unfortunately.
What?
Unfortunately.
Yeah, no, but they have.
Yeah,
In a lot of ways, including the kinetic, right? So a kinetic attack. So in terms of understanding what the cyber threat is to the United States, both state and non-state actor, I'm curious about your thoughts about, forgetting the laws, what the government has done to protect us. I mean, recently, President Obama has appointed, right? Okay, is that enough? And what are they? Nobody really has a sense, although it's changed over time. Are there many players in this? Is that too many voices? Between Homeland Security and the Department of Justice and the Pentagon and the CIA. Is there a sense that, are we replicating the problems that we saw in a different way in the terrorist era? Or are they new problems? And just where does this government stand in terms of its protective apparatus for cyber threats?
Well, I'll start by what's the problem. Today, there are 5 billion devices in the world that are connected to the internet. The Internet of Things, you've heard that term, is expanding at an incredible rate, and certainly well within 10 years. The estimate is that the number of internet-connected devices will go from 5 billion to 50 billion. All right, so 10 times the number of internet-connected devices. Even though we know there are hackers out there who try to hack everything, people are bringing new devices onto the internet without securing them. And that's IV drip machines in hospitals, it's self-driving cars, you name it. It is very, very difficult to write code in a way that it can't be hacked. Not impossible, very difficult. Very, very difficult to set up networks that can't be hacked. Almost impossible. The skill set to do that used to be held by a couple of nation states. And over time, that skill set, the skill set of hacking into any network, has drifted both down and horizontally. So it's drifted down to non-state actors, to individuals, to criminal gangs. It's drifted horizontally from 2 or 3 nations to, last time I counted, 27 nations that have cyber commands, offensive military organizations. So everything is hackable. Lots of people know how to do it. Lots of nation states know how to do it. They do it every day for crime purposes, stealing vast amounts of money, stealing any piece of information that has any value, however temporarily it has value. And the US government hasn't really, it's kind of struggled to figure this out and kind of struggled to respond, and it's never responded in a comprehensive way. Because in part, to do this, the government has to take charge of things that people don't want the government to do. To get this right, the US government has to regulate in a smart way. And the Congress doesn't like to regulate, but we have a lot of cyber regulation at the federal and state level. It's just a mess. It's a hodgepodge, and it's never going to get us to where we need to be. We do not have, as a national policy, we don't even have a national policy, that the government should defend private American companies when they are attacked by foreign nations. Let me say that again. If you're an American company and you are attacked by a foreign nation state, the United States government does not think its obligation extends to defending you. Wow. Ask the banks down the street here that were attacked by Iran 2 years ago. Last month, the Justice Department indicted some guy in Iran. 2 years later, I'm sure the banks like that. Did them a lot of good that 2 years later, some guy got indicted. But for weeks, those banks had their online banking functions knocked off. And really, the first time the US government said it didn't like the fact that a foreign government was attacking a private American corporation was about a Seth Rogen movie.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
So I think we need a policy.
Do you think that that policy is on the way to being made?
No.
Okay. Is there a country in the world that you think, smaller than the United States, perhaps, that has managed this in a way that's a model?
Not a model for the United States. I think Israel does a fairly decent job of defending itself in cyberspace. I think Singapore does. I think South Korea is getting there. They're tiny countries.
Are you going to write a book about this?
Yes.
Thank you. We appreciate that. We are out of time. But in mind, please, for one thing, if you want to know about this, just read his books. And then you can read everybody else's. But start there, which is what I tell all my students. So I'm telling you, thank you so much. Come back.
Thank you.
Yeah.